So today we're going to be looking at A Question of Power, which is the third novel by the South African / Botswanan writer Bessie Head, and is probably the one that is most directly connected to her experiences as a migrant and as a quote-unquote stateless person for a certain period in her life. It also details, through the protagonist's struggles with mental illness, the issues attendant upon a mixed-race migrant in Southern Africa in the 1960s and the 1970s, during, in particular, the era of apartheid in South Africa, in which community lines were very, very clearly drawn. We'll talk a little bit in a moment about how people were categorized into groups and what restrictions were placed on particular groups in a moment. But yeah, the mental illness portions, it can be difficult to read A Question of Power because it's not always entirely clear when Elizabeth is hallucinating and when she is fully engaged in sort of the community life around her. So by and large, the hallucination sequences are responses to things that are happening in Elizabeth's day-to-day life. Right? You have these visions of Sello the monk and Sello in the brown suit. The Medusa who constantly assaults Elizabeth with her femininity, and then Dan who comes in and assaults her with predatory masculine sexuality. All of which characters are sort of constantly reminding her that she is in some way not African enough. So we'll talk about some of the intellectual currents that this is dealing with, this is addressing in a moment. But first, let's talk a little bit about what apartheid was and how it operated, right? Some historical context first. So the first white settlers in South Africa, the first permanent white settlers, arrived in the 17th century, Dutch sailors and traders primarily. In the 19th century, these original Dutch settlers, who were referred to as Afrikaners or Boers, right? They speak their own dialect of Dutch called Afrikaans, came into conflict with British colonists who were entering the region. So here we have a group of Boers armed to the teeth, as you can see, about to go into conflict with their British adversaries. So the British divide South Africa into 4 separate colonies, all of them controlled by white settlers. 2 of those colonies are set aside for British settlers, 2 for Afrikaners. But this is not enough to stave off war between the 2 factions. And so from 1899 to 1902, the British settlers and the Boers, the Afrikaners, go to war against one another. The British win. And in 1910, all 4 of those colonies are officially joined together. And authority for them is handed over to white citizens, British and Boer. Now, a divide remains between the British settlers and the original Dutch settlers, however. The Dutch settlers, the Boers, the Afrikaners, remain predominantly rural. Right? They live on farmsteads well outside of the cities, while the British white population in South Africa is predominantly urban. Black citizens are denied any representation in government and most basic civil rights. So in many ways, they're treated as non-citizens or non-persons by the white regime. Apartheid is established as official government policy in 1948, even though it was in place in practice for much longer. Now, apartheid, which literally means apartness, worked by dividing people up into 4 different classes. You were either white, you were colored, which meant you were mixed race, you were Indian, or you were black. And this was how the hierarchy worked too, right? The closer to white you were, regarded as, the more rights and privileges you had. People who were mixed race were technically not even supposed to exist. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Trevor Noah, who's the host of the Daily Show right now. He is, he's a mixed race South African, and he titled his autobiography "Born a Crime," because it was a crime for a white person to have sex with someone from one of the other classifications. So the birth of a mixed race person was indication that a crime had been committed. But they still tended to have more rights than the Indian or the black population. Now, what were Indians doing in South Africa? We see that they made their way to pretty much every corner of the British Empire, right? In the Caribbean, they'd been brought over to work as indentured servants after the slave system fell apart. In Africa, they had mostly come over to work as engineers and railroad builders as the British tried to connect their various colonies in Africa via rail, and couldn't find local workers with the skills to do the necessary work, and didn't want to use British people on these projects either, so they brought in Indians to do it. And many stayed, and ended up largely as shopkeepers. Right. The most restricted population in this scheme was the black population. All citizens were required to carry racial identity cards, because there were people from each of these 3 racial groups that were not white who might be able to pass for white under certain circumstances. So you had to have your identity confirmed and stamped by the government to make sure that you were in places that you were allowed to be. Right. As I said, marriage and sexual intercourse between persons of different races was strictly prohibited. And if you were black, you were prohibited from entering urban, industrial, and agricultural areas without a special permit, right? You had to get special government permission just to enter a city. Instead, so you couldn't live in the city if you were black. You couldn't live in Johannesburg or Cape Town. You had to live in these sort of rural areas that were called homelands, or also sometimes referred to as kraals, K-R-A-A-L, that were kind of similar in a lot of ways to the reservations that the U.S. government moved Native Americans onto. Right? It was land that was set aside for the use of the indigenous population, but they were kind of stuck and isolated there. They were limited in their ability to go anywhere else, and it was typically not valuable or productive land, nor was it land that had any connection to their historical territorial claims. So, Head was briefly involved in a movement called Pan-Africanism. And I think it's worth explaining this a little bit as well, because it does have some bearing on the novel, particularly with the kind of attacks on Elizabeth for not being African enough. Right, so Pan-Africanism was a political, social, and economic movement, predominantly Marxist in nature, that argued for unity among Africans both on the continent and in the wider diaspora. Right? So probably the big figure in this movement, the big motivating figure in Pan-Africanism, was a guy by the name of Marcus Garvey. Jamaican-born activist and writer. Who argued for the essential unity of all African peoples. Pan-Africanists were generally opposed to any foreign intervention in African affairs. So something like Elizabeth's involvement with this European local industries project, right? On the one hand, it would be good that this is something that's being done by local people in Soroe, the village that she lives in. But it is also a project that is run by Europeans, right? You know, the white schoolmaster is kind of leading light in it, and most of the people teaching the local Africans sustainable farming techniques are Danes or Americans. So this would be a project that a lot of Pan-Africanists would be opposed to. There are other things about Elizabeth's identity that complicate her relationship to this particular movement. Pan-Africanists also tend to support a return to traditional African culture and social values. So you might remember when we talked about Frantz Fanon, and he noted in The Wretched of the Earth, right, that formerly colonized people can't spend too much time dwelling on where they were before the colonists showed up, right? You can't simply turn back the clock and pretend that the colonists were never there, right? You can't just go back to being what you were before. A Pan-Africanist might argue that actually you can, right? That you can erase the traces of the colonist and return to a more traditional African culture and to the social values that predominated before the culture was changed by white settlers. So these are all ideas that are at work within the novel and within Bessie Head's life more broadly. This is probably the most directly autobiographical book she ever wrote. So let's talk a little bit about her own experiences as a migrant, right? Because she was a migrant at the time the novel was written. This is the village of Soroe in what is now Botswana. This is the place that Head fled to in 1964 as the South African government started rounding up and imprisoning various left-wing intellectuals, including Nelson Mandela, who spent, as you probably know, a good number of years in prison. Now, Head herself was not associated with any particular movements. She doesn't seem to have worked very well with other people, and most movements that she got involved with, she ended up leaving under unpleasant circumstances. But nonetheless, people who had been associates of hers and people whose ideas were like hers were getting rounded up. So she managed to get herself a one-way visa out of the country, right? She was permitted to leave South Africa, but was not given a visa to return. And she headed to Botswana. settled in the village of Sorowe. And there she got a job as a primary school teacher and studied sustainable farming, much as Elizabeth does in this novel. She also experienced a mental breakdown, as Elizabeth does in this novel. There was a supposed history of mental illness in Head's family. Let me rephrase that. There was a history of institutionalization in Head's family. Her biological mother was a white woman who had had an affair with a black man who worked for her parents. So when the child was born, she was put up for adoption and was adopted by another mixed-race couple who she believed for much of her childhood to be her biological parents. And her biological mother was institutionalized. Right? Not because of actual mental illness, but because the family wanted to hush up what had happened and keep their daughter out of jail. So, this sort of thing was fairly common in upper-class white families in which one of the children had an affair with a black servant. So this sort of memory of the institutionalized mother continues to haunt much of Head's work and seems to have been a kind of shadow over her life as well. So from 1964 to 1979, she was officially a stateless person, right? She was a citizen of no particular nation, right? She'd been kicked out of South Africa. And Botswana had not yet extended to her an offer of citizenship. Now, there were other nations that offered to make her a citizen and to give her safe haven. For example, she was offered at some point in the early 70s Norwegian citizenship, but she refused to take it. And I think that some of this identity as a stateless person, right, as someone who doesn't belong anywhere, is reflected in Elizabeth's struggles in the novel, right? She has difficulty fitting in Sorowe. She doesn't quite fit in either with the Danes working on the farming project or with the local African community, right? She has these fantasies about Sello and Dan, both of whom they're real people, they're real villagers, both of them are wealthy farmers and landowners. They're important people in the village of Sorowe, but she has visions of them that torment her and that consistently tell her that she's not good enough, that she doesn't belong there. So she's subject throughout the novel to a form of double consciousness. Now, I think we've talked about double consciousness before, but it would probably be a good idea to review because it's been a while. So double consciousness is a term coined by the African-American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois in 1887 in an article that he wrote for the Atlantic magazine. And this is Du Bois. And Du Bois wrote, "It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder." So Du Bois was talking specifically about African American experience, about how being a member of a minority leads you to view yourself through the eyes of the majority culture, right? You are conscious of not being like the power group in society, and yet, because you've grown up in their world, in their society, you have also absorbed many of their values, many of their principles, and you judge yourself according to their standards. Right? So you look at yourself, one, as a member of a minority group, and two, as the majority group sees members of minority groups. This is hence double consciousness, right? So the way this works in the question of power, right? Just to summarize briefly, right? Elizabeth is a mixed race woman who was not native to Sarowe. So she's an outsider in the village, right? She is not of this place, and always looks at herself, right? Sort of torments herself with her outsider status. She is also not wholly European, right? We see this in her arguments with the various white people she encounters. You know, she punches Mrs. Jones, the left-wing British evangelist. There are things that she can't explain. There are differences she has with Tom, the American Peace Corps worker, who seems to be one of the people who gets closest to her. She finds, you know, as far as not being of the place, not being of the village is concerned, she finds not only that she's tortured by visions of Dan and Cello, but Kenosi, the woman whom she works closely with in the garden, she finds kind of inscrutable. And yeah, she's also like not wholly African. Right? She can't quite assimilate to any kind of, like, not just the culture of Sarowe, but to African culture generally, right? She has these memories of her school days in which other children would taunt her, so that the Africans would eat her, right? So the primary thrust of the novel, right, is Elizabeth trying to reconcile all of these opposing principles that sort of mix within her own body and her own imagination, and how they reemerge as madness and hallucination. So this is the primary thing that I want you to be thinking about here as you finish this novel. We're going to be looking at another South African novel, this one by a white author, and actually quite contemporary. It's a quite recent book. So recent that there's virtually no critical apparatus on it yet. It's Zebra Crossing by Meg van der Merwe. So finish up Bessie Head, and we will look at van der Merwe next week.